Hey friends, it's Michael Kingswood coming at you again with story time. Hope everybody's had a good week. Couldn't put any weight on my heel at all. Like tiptoeing across the freaking room because it hurt so bad. I was like, what in the devil? And went to podiatrist and all the things. And they gave me a whole bunch of different exercises to do to supposedly help with it. Didn't help. And I was like, well, I guess I'm not running. At least I got my bike. I can still ride my bike. But, yeah. Anyway, so I focused more on lifting and I focused more on boxing class. Really killing it. Boxing consistently, lifting consistently. Got my bench backed up to where it was before I quit. Before I quit, I guess is the best way to say it. Back up to doing 5x5 sets with about, I did 220 yesterday. It was 225 before I stopped, so I was like, okay, well, that's good. 5 sets at 220. 225, of course, is the minimum goal I wanted because that's what the NFL does, right? You go to the NFL training camp, and they're like, you want to be drafted? Go do bench presses with 225, see what something you can do. And they want you to do 20. Now I'm doing sets of 5, so not quite NFL standards, but for whatever reason, that's stuck in my head for a long time. So if I'm doing sets of 5 at 225, that means my max, 1 rep max is probably around 250, which isn't too bad. I'd like to get it up a little higher, though, because now I got this because A, I hated squats, and B, I was running, and I was doing bicycle rides, and karate, and kung fu, and all sorts of leg work, and I was like, screw squats. But it's not the same, and I had never even heard of deadlifts because I wasn't really all that into lifting. So, my deadlifts right now suck. But my squats, I got them up above 300 to 305. I was doing 305 on Friday, and it was like, wow. So when I get it above 300, I was, you've got this in your head, it's a great big hurdle, 300. And I was like, ooh, well. So, whereas 305 is like, oh, I've already crossed the big hurdle, right? So sets of 5 with that. So probably maxing out, around 330 or so, which, I have no idea. 350 and bench at 250, and then, hey, that's a 1,000-pound club right there. So, yeah, so a little ways off from that still. But, hey, it's doable. Getting there. It's a vanity thing, but it's also important to be in shape, right? Anyway, long story short, it's been a good couple weeks, and so I'm feeling positive about stuff. Got my schedule figured out. Got workout figured out, balance with family and work a little bit figured out, and so that's what's up here. We'll just go straight into Glimmer Vale, shall we? Last time we left, Radric and Julian and Melanie were talking about the results of Radric and Salam's scouts into the bad guys' abode, and they were coming up with a new plan. And so now we rejoin them to see what's going up with that. I'll hope you enjoy. I'll talk to you on the flip side.
Chapter 21. Observation. Melanie met Radric and Julian after the morning's archery instruction, and they all walked to Constable Mallory's office. Unlike the last few times Julian had been there, both constable and deputy were present. They sat in their respective desks looking over paperwork of some sort or other. For a town that was normally quiet, those two seemed to have a lot of paperwork. Mallory looked up as they walked in and nodded in greeting. "Gentlemen?" Then his eyes widened and he stood from yesterday, Radric asked. The constable frowned and made a non-committal gesture. "I'd rather we talk about it in private." Melanie's lips compressed coolly. "Well, it's just that..." Mallory trailed off as Melanie's stare became more and more icy, and her frown became a scowl. Apparently not a total fool, he cleared his throat and gestured towards Fendig. "We haven't learned much yet. Fendig's been on it." Fendig coughed, looking uncomfortable as their gazes turned to him.
"We have not received any reports of additional raids or robberies since Farzel met with the mayor. Are you sure they had just attacked someone?"
Radric replied, "That's what they said, and they had enough money on them, so it certainly looked like it." Fendig frowned and looked through his documents again. He shook his head, looking confused.
"I don't know where..."
Out eventually. Turning back to Mallory, he cleared his throat. "We've been making better progress with our recruits than I expected. I think they're almost ready to take into action." "Well, that's good. What did you have in mind?" Now that we know the location of their base, we're going to deploy some of our men to keep an eye on them. Once we know their operating patterns well enough, we'll begin harassing.
Your last plan didn't work out very well. Why should this one turn out any differently?
Because this is not their plan, Mr. Mallory. It is mine, Melanie said in her best, most condescending tone. Annoying as it was to be on the receiving end of that tone of voice, Julian had to admit it was effective. The constable blinked, looking defensive all of a sudden.
I appreciate that, Mistress Clemens, but—
Do you have a better idea, Constable? Asked Raedric. Mallory thought about it for a moment, then shook his head with a shrug. In that case, we'd like your help.
Anything we can do.
Mallory stomped his feet and hugged his arms tightly across his chest, rubbing his upper arms vigorously. It was bloody freezing. When he said anything we can do, he thought Balatir would ask him to help prepare defenses around town or something. Not sit out in the middle of nowhere all night and freeze his tail off. He and one of Balatir's fishing men, Gilroy, were camped on a hilltop near a great crack in the hillside. Balatir and his friend called it a chasm, but that was a misnomer if ever Mallory heard one. It was more like a chimney than a chasm. But then Balatir did not strike him as much of an outdoorsman. Probably never tried his hand at mountain climbing, or he would have known the difference. There was no way that 30 to 40 men were encamped in that little crack, so what in the hell was he doing here? He would bet 2 to 1 this was just some scheme to get him out of town so those two and their little trollop could do God's knew what all without interference.
This is a waste. That's the second hole you've dug in the last 10 minutes.
Gilroy spread his hands in a no idea kind of way.
Just doing what the lady told me. How's that?
Gilroy stood and picked up a small bag that was sitting on the ground next to him. Fishing inside it, he pulled out a small object and held it out to Mallory.
She said to take these and bury 'em in a ring around our campsite. Wouldn't say why.
Mallory accepted the object and turned it over in his fingers. It was just a small piece of rock, mica from the look of it, with a small engraving of a person crouched beneath a shelter of some kind on one side.
What is this?
Don't know. She just said to bury 'em with the carving facing outward and we would be safe through the night.
Great. Superstitious nonsense. That was all he needed. It was bad enough the mayor insisted on shackling him with that pair, but now they brought a bloody-minded woman into it with a bunch of silly notions. He shook his head vigorously.
I'll have none of that foolishness. Rocks to keep us safe.
He snorted and tossed the rock off into the grass.
Safe from what?
Gilroy gasped as Mallory threw the rock away.
Sir, she said it was very important,
he said, and he bounded off in search of it. How he thought to find his face. Mallory scowled and waved vigorously for him to come back.
Now, Gilroy!
The fishing man looked one last time at the grass where the rock fell, then nodded and walked back to camp, his eyes downcast. She was very specific, Constable. He snorted again.
Specifically foolish.
Mallory turned and stomped over to the edge of the hill. The last of the light was just about gone, but he could just make out the valley below and the bottom of the chimney. Nothing moved down there.
Watch,
he growled to Gilroy. Then he rolled over to go to sleep. Gilroy ran. Despite the burning in his lungs from breathing the cold night air, despite the crushing pain in his side and the wetness running down his hip and thigh, despite the fatigue that made his legs feel like rubber, despite every part of his body screaming at him to stop. They had been on his tail for hours, it felt like. To think they had decided to stop chasing him now after all that time was foolhardy at best. So he kept on running. They came just after midnight, as he was turning over the watch to the constable. It had taken forever to wake him up, and then he had done nothing but grumble before finally getting up to take the watch. And fires. It was going to take forever to get to sleep in the cold, especially with Mallory stomping around. Eventually, he managed to set aside his general discomfort and doze off. The sound of a twig snapping startled him to wakefulness. Sitting upright, he ignored the rush of cold as his blanket fell off his body and looked around. Mallory stood off to the side, closer to the edge of the chimney, looking down into the valley.
Did you hear that?
Gilroy whispered as urgently as he dared. Mallory turned his head toward Gilroy and sniffed.
Go back to bed or I will. No, really, I heard something.
Gilroy stood up. As he did, he heard a soft whistling, then something slammed into his side and sent him tumbling back as he was doing it. Anxiously grasping at his side, his hand came to rest on a long, thin piece of wood. An arrow. On the other side of the camp, Mallory shouted an oath. He felt a flash of shame, but forced it down. There was nothing he could do for Mallory. He had to take his own life into consideration now. Gilroy reached a small tree near the edge of the camp. Leaning against the tree for a moment, he looked back and saw Mallory pinned to the ground beneath a great bear of a man. 3 others stood nearby, one of them grasping at his arm as though wounded. That Gilroy had fallen and breathed a curse when he saw that Gilroy was no longer there.
Find him, you fool!
Barked the leader. Gilroy did not need any more encouragement. He turned on. At some point, he could hardly remember when, he had snapped the arrow off in the wound. It hurt enough that he actually passed out for a moment, but he managed to make better time without the shaft impeding the movement of his arms. Gilroy managed to smile in spite of it all. There ahead of him, as the western sky began to lighten from the pre-dawn glow, he could just make out the—
This is a disaster! A total disaster!
Julian looked over at Fendig and felt a surge of contempt. Ever since they received the news of what happened, he had been less encouraged at all. Julian just rolled his eyes.
The real question is what to do now.
The mayor did not look any more pleased than Fendig. And, truth be told, Julian was upset as well, though he suspected not for the same reason they were. They cared about Mallory, and that was fine. In Julian's mind, the greater cause to be upset, angry even, was that the whole thing was preventable. If they had just set up the ring like Melanie told them to.
Now you do your mayor thing and keep everyone calm,
Raedric said.
We'll continue fortifying the town. That's it?
Raedric nodded.
That's it for now. What about the constable?
Fendig demanded. Then, when they've learned all they think they can, they'll either kill him or send us a demand for ransom. Fendig paled and licked his lips.
Kill him?
It's possible, Raedric replied, looking askance at Julian.
But not likely. Eisenhoff knows Lyttelton values him, so he is worth more alive than dead. I'd expect a ransom demand.
Looking at the mayor, he put on an apologetic expression.
Looks like the payment due next week just got a bit bigger.
The mayor sighed and slumped.
What? We need to do something else besides fortify.
Julian shrugged.
Hiram are all for good shots. The others are becoming decent. Why don't we just attack? We were going to in a few days anyway.
Raedric shook his head.
They'd kill Mallory for sure. And that will be his own damn fault. Bloody fool.
It had been a long time since breakfast. He picked up the pace toward the taproom door, but froze as Raedric grabbed his arm. Julian turned around to tell him to let go, but his friend suddenly wore a deadly serious expression. Moving in a bit closer, Raedric spoke in a low tone of voice.
Maybe not. He and Gilroy had the first shift, and they lit no fire. Even with Melanie's concealment circle incomplete, don't you think it was awfully convenient that Eisenhoff's men showed up right then?
Julian frowned. He's not a fool. He probably has his men do sweeps every so often.
Yes, but to find them so quickly, they could have been stationed on any one of a dozen hilltops nearby.
Julian saw where he was going, and did not like it one bit. You think he's getting information from someone? Raedric nodded.
It's the only explanation that makes sense. Someone told him where to look for our scouts and when.
There's only a few people who knew the plan.
I know.
Who just likes making things difficult for his characters or something. Man, what a jerk. Well, hey, at least Gilroy got away. Hopefully the constable's alright, or not dead. I guess we'll find out. And we'll find out what happens next week. Of course, you can find out immediately. All you gotta do is buy the book. You can get it from Amazon, or iBooks, or Kobo, or any place else you can buy books. You can get the audiobook from Audible, or iTunes, or audiobooks.com, or Kobo, or any place you can get audiobooks. But the best place to get them, because I get the most money, is straight from my website at ssnstorytelling.com. I'll tell you, I'm almost never there, because as I've said before, I hate Facebook. And really the only reason I even have that anymore is for this writer thing, and I'm there so unoften, I almost don't know why I bother. But it is still there. Occasionally I'll go check it out, and you go from there. Yeah, if you want to get in on the mailing list so you know when my new stuff comes out before anybody else does, and so you can get special deals, go to my website at michaelkingswood.com and sign up there. Otherwise, just come back here next week and we'll continue. I hope you have a great week. Don't do anything that I wouldn't do.